This is a basic demonstration of how I lubricate keyboard switches with grease and a paintbrush. First, you need to open the switch. There's a couple ways you can do this. There are special opener tools, such as this one, the Tribosys opener, where you insert the switch like this, and then you push down, and when you release, the top comes off, and you can pull it the rest of the way off. And then you'll see inside of the switch you have the spring and the switch stem, and the two protrusions on top, which are called the switch legs, they go facing towards the copper colored piece, which is called the leaf. So this is the way the stem fits. I'll set that aside. Now if you don't have one of these special opener tools, you can also use SMD tweezers. You can insert the tweezers under the teeth of the switch here and pry up and forward to open one side. Then you can firmly hold the side that you've already opened between your fingertips so that it doesn't snap back shut again, and turn the switch around and pry open the other side. Now when I'm ready to start lubricating my switches, I like to take some amount of grease that will last for a bunch of switches, and I like to put it on the back of my finger, and then I use this area of my finger sort of like my palette as I'm painting the grease on, because I need to load my brush with enough grease to where I can get a smooth and consistent application on the switch parts that I'm painting, but I don't want to have too much grease on the brush either. So I'll typically dab some grease on the brush, make sure that the brush is saturated, and then I'll wipe on a cleaner part of my skin here to make sure that I don't have too much grease in the brush. Now I do the bottom housing first. Typically I'll usually paint these two side rail areas. And then I'll usually apply some to the inside of this center post hole by inserting my brush and just kind of spinning it. And then I'll paint some grease onto the outside of that center tube, like this. And I'll try to make sure that I'm also getting grease on the bottom surface there, because that's the surface that the spring touches when the spring is in the switch. So I'll make sure that I'm getting some grease on the bottom of the switch housing around the edges of this center tube, and then I'll make sure that I'm getting some grease on these two bumps on the copper colored leaf, because these two bumps rub against the plastic stem. So these are definitely areas of friction. So that lower housing is done. Now for the switch top, on the inside of the opening that the switch stem slides in and out of, there are 4 areas of friction. These 2 rails here, and then on the other side there's 2 rails that also slide against the stem. And then on these corners there are also rails. So I'll just paint a little bit, just a very light brush of grease onto those areas. Not everyone paints lube onto the switch tops. It's kind of optional, but it does give you a more buttery and quieter sound, a more buttery feel. And then I like to put a tiny little dab here, because when the stem tops out, this is the part that's impacted by the stem on its way up, and then again on the other side. And I find that this, having a tiny bit of grease there, makes the top out sound of the switch quieter. Now the switch bottom housing and top housings are done. As for the spring, there's a lot of things you can do with springs. You can dip them in oil, you can shake them in a bag or in a tub, you can paint oils and greases onto them, but just for the sake of simplicity for this demonstration, I'll just use the same grease that I'm using on the other parts, because you can use the same lube everywhere. So I'll just make sure that I get some on the ends of the spring. That's the most important part, so that there isn't like a grinding sound. But then to make sure that your springs don't ping or make a ringing sound, you want to make sure that you get some on the entire length of the spring. You want to make sure you get a little bit of grease on the whole spring, and that'll keep it quiet. And you can place the spring there onto the peg that holds it. Now, last but not least, the stem. I like to use this pronged gem holder tool because it holds the stem securely, and it allows me to rotate it so that I can paint each surface of the stem. So this part's really simple. You just paint and turn it. Make sure you get each side. Make sure you get an even, consistent coat. And then I also like to paint the center post here. And I like to make sure that I get some grease up underneath the bottom, because that's where the stem rubs. I mean the spring. That's where the spring will rub when you're using the switch. So I insert my brush and turn it to get grease up in there. So now the stem's fully greased. Go ahead and place it on here, onto the spring. And if you have one of these switch modding stations, you can use it to assemble your switches, and you can do your lubing in an assembly line kind of fashion. That's what I like to do. Then once you've got everything lined up, make sure you've got the little legs of the stem facing towards the copper colored leaf. And when you go to put your top on, the part of the top that doesn't have any holes or slits for the LED is the part that goes where the copper colored leaf is. You can carefully place it on, make sure it's lined up, the four corners, the four little teeth are lined up, and then push down and it'll snap on. Now when I take my switches out of the lube station and I'm ready to put them in the keyboard, I like to do an extra step to make sure the tops are on all the way. I'll firmly hold the switch bottom in one hand, and with the other hand I'll push down and kind of squeeze the little teeth here, make sure that they're all snapped securely in. Now this switch is ready to use in a keyboard. It feels really smooth. Thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful.